Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Today is the day we do Mythbusters. The co-host today is Chris Rossini, and he is also the editor of the Ron Paul LibertyReport.com. Chris, welcome to the program today.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. It's great to be with you again.
Chris, before we get started on today's program, I wonder if you'd give our audience an update on about how our webpage is doing. We've been working with not a tremendously long time, but I assume that we're doing okay?
Yes, we are. Fortunately, we are. This month, we're having a record month on our website. We just crossed 1 million page views for this month, and we still have a little less than half a month to go, so we're going to keep climbing. But yes, if you love this show every day, you're going to love the website as well. So if you haven't visited it, it's ronpaullibertyreport.com. And we curate some of the finest libertarian stories and commentaries out there. So thank you if you have been visiting, and thank you for sharing. Please continue to share, and we really appreciate you keeping up with us. So now on to the show. Today, Dr. Paul, we're going to talk about a topic from the last and final presidential debate. One of the topics that they both discussed was the economy, and it was pretty cringeworthy from a free market perspective. So I'm going to read some quotes from that debate, and maybe you can abolish some of these myths that still exist. The first, we're going to take a quote from Hillary Clinton, and she said, quote, "I want us to have the biggest jobs program since World War II, jobs in infrastructure and advanced manufacturing." What do you think, Dr. Paul?
Right out of the 1930s, and it's exactly the policy that took a downturn that could have been limited to 1 year, like the Depression of 1921, and turned it into the Great Depression. It was this attitude of the government being in charge. And they believe that actually if you get people, they literally believe this, which is hard to understand. They believe if you just give people money, even if you have to print the money or borrow the money, to go out and dig a ditch, even if it's not an important ditch for anything, and then another crew come by and fill up the ditch, it would be good for the economy. If the economy is sluggish and the government's not spending enough money and the people are scared of the economy for various reasons and insults the government has placed on them, that just pay people to dig ditches and prosperity will come. Well, this is such a fallacy, and unfortunately it's been around for a long time, especially in the last century, because we were well on our way in the early part of our history to understanding free markets and sound money and limited government. But in the last 100 years, ever since we had an income tax, the expansion of the welfare state, we have the Federal Reserve System, where you have a foreign policy that changed dramatically 100 years ago. Everything has changed. And somebody says, well, I guess what we need, since the jobs programs of the 30s didn't work, but the jobs program of the war worked. So maybe what we need is a good old-fashioned war, because certainly the World War II ended unemployment. Yeah, I would concede that. Unemployment, yeah, we drafted millions of people, 5 million people, sent them overseas. A bunch of them got killed. Didn't build a thing, build tanks and bombs and all that. This is, separate from the necessity or whether it was really necessary to fight the war. But this idea that war has anything to do with enhancing prosperity. I'm old enough to remember the tail end of the Depression and World War II. And believe me, World War II especially, because we had a small business, a dairy business, and we had to do with rationing stamps and the conditions that people had, and buying cars or no cars. The Depression lasted well past 1941. The Depression really technically ended when the debt was wiped out and they went back to work after World War II. But for Hillary to say that we need a jobs program, we need to do things for small businesses, well, no. The government needs to get out of the way and let the business people make the decision. And where we're going right now is not a restoration of confidence in the free market. And you said that there wasn't much talk of what a true free market would be all about. I'd have to say, Trump is a little bit better on this. He wants less taxes and less regulations, but he fluffs off the spending. He said, we'll have a healthy economy and that'll pay for it. Well, we've heard that before. We'll take care of waste and fraud and then we're going to pay for it because we do want a jobs program on the infrastructure and we do want to put more money into education, and we certainly have to build up our mediocre military. We are just losing the way and we're running out of steam, so we have to rebuild it. So that doesn't offer much. But those are all myths, and government spending, government printing of money, government manipulation of money and credit, the very depressions and recessions that they cause, that the Federal Reserve is going to solve that problem. Well, now they have created a huge bubble in the stock market and especially in the bond market and the dollar bubble, and all they can do is let's make the bubble bigger. So I would say that we didn't hear the answers yet. We didn't hear the answers of get rid of the debt, get rid of the malinvestment, restore some money, and obviously a lot less regulations. And then they wonder, why are the jobs going overseas? Well, people think of America as the free country, but now other countries have better tax structures and less regulations and less waste in the militarism that we put our money into, and they're doing better than us. And then all of a sudden, because of artificially high wages in this country, and nobody can lower wages, that would be sinful, the businessman leaves because he wants his business to succeed. He has an obligation to make profits and take care of his the consumers, as well as taking care of the stockholders. And they can't do it here anymore. I saw nothing really to change that direction in a significant way. And obviously, Hillary suggesting that we have more jobs programs as we had in the 1930s. Believe me, that won't help at all.
Yes, next we'll move to Donald Trump, and he really did drop the ball this time. What an opportunity to take a free trade position, but he too is an interventionist, just one of a slightly different color, and he likes to wrap his arguments with the words free trade. So here's his quote. He says, "So my plan, we're going to negotiate trade deals. We're going to have a lot of free trade, more free trade than we have right now. But we have horrible deals." Now, what's wrong with these statements, Dr. Paul?
Well, it's depending on government to make deals, and I guess he brags about making deals, so he's going to be a deal maker. Well, in a free society, the people make the deals, the consumer makes the deal, the consumer is the king. Everything is directed toward the consumer, and the consumer decides really what wages will be and what prices will be and where the investments go. So making a deal with an international organization. Now, he does say some decent things about some of those organizations, how bad NAFTA is, but he's still not saying what we need to do is just eliminate all that. He says, you need a good deal maker. You need me to negotiate these deals so they don't push us around. No, we need the free market. Now, this whole idea, and the big myth here, and it's always disturbing because it's hard to dismiss, because a lot of libertarian groups are sympathetic to these trade agreements, even though the Congress illegally and unconstitutionally gives power to the president to negotiate these deals, and the Congress can't change them. And the president doesn't have the authority to do that under the Constitution. Only Congress can regulate foreign trade. So we deliver it to the president, and then he creates and joins these international organizations. And it's impossible that they don't know what is best. Only the market knows. You need supply and demand. You need market rates of interest. And it doesn't even deal with that because the businessman is going to continue to make mistakes if he doesn't get the right information. And only savings and market rates of interest will make the difference. Instead, they substitute it and say, well, the Fed will take care of it. They'll print the money. They create capital. The Fed can't create capital. The only reason that when they increase the money supply that access capital, it dilutes the other capital and makes the country weaker. And of course, that's where we are today. We don't have a capitalistic free market economy. But these trade agreements cannot give us free trade. Free trade is really based on a moral principle in economics, and that is the consumer should make the decision. The consumer should have the right to keep the fruits of their labor, and then they ought to be able to decide where the tennis shoes come from and where the automobiles come from. If they start buying tennis shoes and automobiles from somebody else, we need to wake up, and decide, well, why aren't we competitive and why don't we change it? But the real difficult area here is the lack of discussion and understanding how the Federal Reserve gets involved with the manipulation of the currency. And I'm not talking about the Chinese manipulating their currency. I'm talking us being able to have the privilege of printing the gold. Our fiat dollar now is so-called the gold because everybody keeps it in reserves, but a lot less so now than they did even a year ago. But as long as the dollar is so important, it's very encouraging for us to live on this. They say the unemployment rate is real low, except a lot of other people dropped out of the labor market and we don't count them anymore. So they manipulate this, and then we print the money. It makes it very easy. Easy come, easy go. We don't have to earn our money. In a gold standard, you have to earn your money. You have to sell something. But no, we just print the money, and then we buy stuff from overseas, and then they say, well, it's all their fault. It's inability for introspection. That the people generally is true. No individual likes to do it. No country likes to do it. But you have to look into yourself and decide, well, maybe our policies have something to do with. And it might not be the management of a international group like NAFTA or the WTO. It's the principle that it shouldn't exist, and they're dealing with the management of something that is impossible to manage because they don't know the information, and only the marketplace can sort it out.
Yes, next we'll go back to Hillary Clinton, and it's always dangerous when you hear a politician that says, I'm from government and I'm here to help. We saw that recently with the college kids. Government helped them to get into college, and now the kids are straddled with debt. So it looks like help. You're actually going to end up as a victim. So here comes Hillary the helper during the debate. I want us to do more to help small business. That's where 2/3 of the new jobs are going to come from. I want us to raise the national minimum wage because people who work full-time should not still be in poverty. Now, please, Dr. Paul, explain the 2 steps beyond where people will end up getting hurt with this.
Well, the one statement that we can concede a little bit to Hillary is, in general, it is said that, a lot of under today's condition, a lot of the new jobs are the small companies. But getting involved and pushing small companies versus somebody else, that is not going to help. What you want is just a free market economy, and small businesses will be there. Right now, we do have a system that is designed to use the government power to move monopolies toward the bigger companies. We don't have small banks now because the banking system controls the Federal Reserve and they control banking regulation, so it hurts the small banker. So what you don't want are subsidies to the small companies. What you want is to get the government out of the way and make sure the government never helps big companies, and that's cronyism, and that is the big problem. So this idea that we pick out a group and we're going to designate the help. I was thinking about this subject when I heard what she was saying, and I thought, well, she doesn't understand how the market works. And I kept thinking, in my lifetime, in our little community, we had, I worked in a drugstore, and that was when I was making 35 cents an hour, but it was still a job for me and it was worthwhile. But next door was a little grocery store. In our whole town, that's where people came, in this little grocery store, and they'd come and pick out a few things. Very, very inefficient. But it wasn't too long after that all of a sudden you didn't have to go too far and you have an A&P. And have a chain store and you could buy more and it became cheaper. My goodness, we're going to put the little grocery stores out of business. Yeah, that was the case. But what happened after the original chain stores came along, grocery stores? And then all of a sudden we had Walmart and H-E-B come into super stores. Well, that's the way the market worked. But lo and behold, guess what? We have dollar stores coming up now where you can go in and you don't want to fight the crowd. And dollar stores are every place, and they're very productive, and they go to the consumer and they take care of the consumer. The little grocery store I mentioned, they used to even deliver groceries to doors, to help people. But now the modern technique now is delivering of grocery stores is done, in a much more efficient fashion, and more of that is to come. But that's only because the market is allowing this transition to go. So to pick out one, we need to get rid of the subsidies to the big corporations. Monopolies, I truly believe, can never exist unless they're protected by government. And small business people can't compete because they're going to get subsidies. They have to compete because the market is free and they compete. Most of the lawsuits against monopolies are usually structured against people who don't want the competition. But what we need to do is recognize the consumer will dictate what kind of a store you're going to go to, and the subsidies, to the small business people, and manipulation of wages. It is so unproductive. Whether it's the minimum wage or the interference in the wages through powerful unions, especially public unions. Right now, our cities can't pay the pension funds. They're going bankrupt, and there's a lot more to come on this. But it was the power of the unions. When we were very, very rich, we could get away with it, and we cared about the middle class and the poor. We'll raise minimum wage, but it always backfires. What you're doing, if you have an economic ladder, you're just cutting the first step away from them, and they can't get started. And we have to look at this more as a moral issue, that people have the right to work at the price that they want to. So what these laws do literally means that the government are writing laws to prohibit employment. So if somebody says the minimum wage is $15 and they're having trouble and they might close down, I say, well, and then somebody comes up knocking on the door, and he is an honest worker and wants to work. He says, I'll work for $10 an hour. And the businessman wants to hire him. He's not allowed to do that. Same way with union wages. They have to protect it. So they are contributing to the unemployment and makes this problem much worse. So if you really care about the middle class and the poor people and the small businessman, get the government out of the way and let the market operate. And believe me, that is the only conditions where you'll have the largest and the freest and most prosperous middle class.
Finally, Dr. Paul, let's step back a little bit, and for our last topic, we're now slightly over 100 years into the so-called progressive era, where the dominant belief is that government force and government violence can improve society. And we can see that it still exists today in the presidential debates, because it's always asking, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? How are you going to use government violence and force? So shouldn't we be looking for the opposite, finally? How would a free society operate?
Well, we had a test of it in our early history, but it was far from perfect, because some of these arguments existed, at the time of our founding. Jefferson and Hamilton argued the case about central banking, and immediately they started regulating. I always resented the fact that one of the first things that Washington did was put an excise tax on alcohol. And the reason why I was sensitive about that is about a quarter mile from my house where I lived in Pittsburgh, we called it Whiskey Hollow, because Washington, as president, took the troops over there. We are going to collect this excise tax. And so we had that institution, but there was still a release of a lot of creative energy. It was probably the best revolution ever known, but it was immediately undermined. There was always this competition of people who want power. I think the people who want power are probably the biggest instigator, rather than people who want the government to do it. But it's easy to come together, then the people become dependent. I think that the most important question for we as a nation must ask right now is, what should the role of government be? Well, if you want a socialist system, you have to define what the government's going to do. If you want an interventionist system like we have today, where the government's always regulating and picking and choosing their special interests, you just have to do what we're doing today. But if you want to live in a free society, and a prosperous society, and one that can give us the best chance for peace, then you have to say the role of government then is quite different. And the founders gave us an outline on it. And of course, there were some shortcomings in that. But they've given us a chance that we could slowly and carefully change that document. But today we just ignore it. But it was well spelled out in Article 1, Section A of what the President and the Congress was allowed to do. They listed, you have authority to do this. So if we want to live in a free society, we have to challenge this notion, which is a liberal notion, and it's accepted, nobody really challenges, that governments and presidents can do anything they want as long as it has not been explicitly prohibited. But that's not the way it is. They did it the other way. He's prohibited from doing anything unless it's in the Constitution that said, this is what you can do. You can't go to war unless the Congress does this. But who cares about that anymore? So you'd have to make that decision. What should the role of government be in a free society? Pick up where the founders left off and say the purpose of the government in a free society is to protect liberty. It's not to manage people's lives. It's not for people to regulate and manage the economy. It's not for regulating the money supply and interest rates. It's not to police the world. And that would be a completely different story than what we have today. So this would be based then on the principle of nonviolence and non-force, and that's all we have today. You listen to these debates, you listen to what Congress says, it's always this. And the people are accustomed to it. I want government to do this. The government can do this and pay for this. They have to reject this notion that the government has nothing except what they steal from somebody else, and they do it in various ways through taxation, inflation, and borrowing, and all these things. And then we release this creative energy that comes from a free society that we had a good taste of for 100 years or so. But as you mentioned, the progressive era started about 100 years ago. Income tax and Federal Reserve and foreign policy changes, entitlement system, and it's gradually gotten worse. And we're at the point now of bankruptcy, no return. You can't doctor this up anymore. There's not enough wealth to pretend that if we just tinker with this, we can do another 50 years with it. Nope, it's not going to work that way. This has to be addressed. We have to decide what kind of a society we want to live in and then say, this is the type of government we want. And believe me, we will not be able to tolerate what we have now. And one presidential election, as I see it, won't make much difference until we get a different understanding with the people in this country to say, I'm for liberty, I understand it, I want my freedom, and it is the road to peace and prosperity. Under those conditions, I think we could be very happy. Now, the good news is that these ideas are well entrenched. I didn't invent them. They've been around for a long, long time. But there's a lot more people now that are looking this way at the failure of what we have. We just haven't had too much discussion of the strict rule and regulation and restrictions on the role of government. And yet there are a lot of people, millions of Americans who understand this. So there's reason to be very hopeful that as time goes on, we will have the corrections made. But I'm not predicting it's going to be a consequence and a result of today's election. But I do want to thank everybody for tuning in. And Chris, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Doc.
Good. And to the audience, thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the program. Please come back soon to the Liberty Report.